Welcome back to Just Liberty, friends, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Allred, president of the Church State Council. My co-host, Bettina Krause, came down sick today, and I had the last-minute insight to invite my friend and colleague, Steve Allred, who is our legislative director for the Church State Council, to be a guest co-host today. We do our own podcast occasionally at Church State Council Today podcast, but this is Just Liberty, where we are trying desperately to take back liberty from the political extremes. And today we have a topic that is absolutely a front burner, barn burner topic that everybody really needs to have more insight about, which is theological influences on American foreign policy and the war in Iran. What are the kinds of strains of beliefs about end-time events that are having real-world consequences in influencing those who are making decisions about our policy? Whether you agree with the policy or not is not what we're going to talk about today, but what these influences are. So, Steve, please introduce our special guest.
Well, it's good to be here, Alan, and thank you for having me, I guess, as a co-host. And we miss Bettina, but she'll be back. And we're really happy to have Dr. André Gagné, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, with us today. His teaching focuses on the global Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, along with the intersection between religion and politics. He's authored a number of books, the most recent being American Evangelicals for Trump, Dominion, Spiritual Warfare, and the End Times, which, by the way, looks really interesting, and I have not read it, but I want to. And he just authored an article in Liberty Magazine, which I have read and is excellent, titled Remaking the Kingdom. So, Dr. Gagné, thanks for being with us here today. And the first thing I want to ask you about is, as we just mentioned, you study the intersection of theology and politics, which is becoming much more relevant these days. What are you seeing right now that people might be missing that could help them better understand what's going on in American politics right now?
First of all, I really want to thank you for this kind invitation. It is really an honor for me to be with you and talk with you about this fascinating time in which we live in. Yes, a lot of people are missing what's going on in the relationship between politics and religion. When you look at a lot of political analyses, it's about political analyses, and it's very rarely about what's happening at the ground level. Who influences who? Who's voting for who? And what's very important to understand is that a lot of the policies and a lot of what we see today are the result of having elected President Donald Trump in America. And those that have facilitated this election, of course, are often those that are referred to as white evangelicals. So if you remember in 2016, 81% of white evangelicals had voted for Trump. And in 2020, when he sought re-election, that was the same percentage for 2020. He lost the election, even if he says that the election was stolen. But then back in 2024, again, these white evangelicals voted with even greater proportions at 85%. So essentially what we're seeing unfold in the context of American policy and politics is that there's actually a transactional relationship between President Trump and a lot of these evangelicals that voted for him. They voted for him because they had preoccupations about their own religious freedom, or at least how they understand religious freedom, or the predominance of Christian values in America. And they had grievances also. And Trump listened to them. So that's one thing that is very important. Trump really heard them, and he actually delivered what they were expecting. You see, when his first term, some of the things that he did, he got the American embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So for a lot of Christians that have a end times perspective, that was significant for them. Putting also 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court. That had a profound impact on the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And
well, Professor,
again,
to one thing you said earlier about
Yeah.
what the press is missing, they're focusing on the political dimension and not the beliefs behind them.
Yeah.
Well, the secular press doesn't really understand much about religion.
It's true.
So, you know, what I really want, and they certainly have, you know, talked plenty about evangelical support for Trump, but much, much less about what those folks are believing and why those beliefs are shaping their support for Trump.
Yeah.
So that's where I think we need to go in this conversation.
Yeah. And it's true because they've talked about these evangelicals, but the actual beliefs that drive a lot of these policies and ideas, they're not as familiar. For example, there is a strong political theology that undergirds a lot of what they view as the importance of Christian hegemony in the context of American society. This political theology, we call it often dominion theology or dominionism. And it's really this idea that they believe that God has called Christians to take control of political and cultural institutions in a given country. In order to change society, in order to transform it into their type of Christianity, of what they view as being the authentic Christianity. And of course, there's the political theology, and that's one thing. But at the same time, there's how do you go from the political theology to actually implementing this theology? So they came up with, a lot of them, with this concept called the 7 Mountain Mandate. So the 7 Mountain Mandate is essentially looking at society in general and understanding society as being comprised of various spheres or mountains, such as religion, education, the family, media, business, arts and entertainment, and so on, politics also. So the importance to fulfill this idea of dominion theology is to get people in the right positions at the top of these spheres or mountains, so that these spheres or mountains that are led by influential individuals at the top of those spheres will change the culture within those spheres. And we see it in politics, we see it in education, we see it in the media, we see it across the board, where there is a willingness to align what is happening in those spheres to their type of Christian values and ideas.
Interesting. And so, Dr. Gagné, at its core, what do you think is driving this way of thinking?
But essentially what they view, and that has been it's been a long process. And there's always been this idea that we're engaged in this kind of cultural war, that America's foundation, Judeo-Christian foundation, has been eroded because of secular humanism. So there's this perception that, you know, God is not part of Christians, of American society anymore. And there's a reason for that. It's because of the prevalent, secular humanist tendencies and views to kind of control everything from politics to education to policies on the family and so on. So there is a reason and there's a will to push back against that, to bring America back to God. And to do that, Christians need to be involved. They need to be involved politically. They need to be involved politically at the local level, but also in school boards and higher political state levels and so on. So that's what drives it. And at the same time, it's not only this erosion of Judeo-Christian values within American context, the American context. There's also a driving fear amongst many of these people that if they don't engage in warning this generation of their sin, of their ways of life, and are not engaged in trying to change this generation and turn it towards God, God will make them accountable to that. You see, God will make them accountable. They see themselves as similar to the watchmen that you hear about in the book of Ezekiel, where you see the danger, and if you don't blow the trumpet to warn individuals of the incoming danger. So there was this idea that Ezekiel saw himself as this kind of spiritual watchman, to warn the people that God would judge them if they did not turn away from their evil ways. But if Ezekiel did not do his, or not take his own responsibilities seriously, God would ask Ezekiel, he would make Ezekiel, in fact, accountable for not having met the responsibilities that he had. So a lot of these Christians view themselves in that sense. They say, we have to warn this generation. We have to warn America of the impending judgment of God on the nation. And if we don't, God will judge us. So there's these two elements that are there. There's of course, the corruption that they see, and we need to stand for what is right, stand for God. But at the same time, there's this idea of accountability towards God for our own responsibility as Christians to warn this, what they deem to be this evil generation.
Interesting.
So far, you've been talking about kind of the theology as it relates to, I would say, domestic politics and kind of, current kind of social culture war issues and that sort of thing. We're in the middle of a war in Iran. The headline this morning, as we're recording, is that Iran is rejecting Trump's peace initiative. By the time this airs, we may not still be at war. Who knows how long this is going to last. But you've also written about the influence of end time beliefs, eschatology. And, in particular, I'm interested to know, when I came up as a brand new Christian, I'm from a Jewish family by birth and all, New York City family. It was very interesting to be exposed to kind of, Hal Lindsey and late great Planet Earth kinds of things, kind of traditional premillennialist views about, a rapture, which is completely unbiblical, tribulation, which, I like the idea of not having to go through it, but that's unbiblical too. At least the return of Christ being before the millennium, that clearly is biblical. But so you've got this premillennial idea that has influence, and then you have the post. That seems to be waning in influence today, and a post-millennialism epitomized by our Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, who clearly embraces a post-millennialist view. Our Vice President, J.D. Vance, embraces a slightly different but similar view within a Roman Catholic context, which has been described as kind of a revival of the medieval notion of the church having very prominent role in taking spiritual responsibility and directing the affairs of state. Talk about how is it that these differing theologies of end times have influenced, for example, American policy in Iran, if you believe they have. I don't want to make any assumptions here, but I'll give a hint. We did talk about this before the interview, so
no, it's a great question, and it's true. This is actually the missing dimension in a lot of the analyses that we find in terms of this war. There's a lot of political commentaries and geopolitical strategizing and economics, and which is great and very necessary, but there is an undercurrent religious framework or framing of this war. We've seen it right after the first strikes on February 28th. Franklin Graham reacting right away, praying for the president and praying for the military, and he's calling it on his social media platform on X to pray for the president, pray for the Iranian people so that they will be liberated from the bondage of Islam. So you're already in a kind of a dichotomy here. This is like framed as a kind of religious war. And others talking about what's the next thing coming up in the calendar of God's events is the rapture. So you have people like Greg Laurie, who's been doing video after video trying to explain in the context of a dispensational premillennial perspective, and I would add pre-tribulational rapture perspective. That's his view, essentially. And it is not a new view. Like you mentioned, Alan, like Great Planet Earth, and even prior to that, it goes back to G.N. Darby, who greatly popularized in the 19th century this idea, and it survived. And it's still something that a lot of American Christians, especially evangelicals, there's still a lot of people that do embrace that. When you talk about the rapture, even non-Christians, it's so much a part of the collective psyche. Everybody knows what the rapture is, essentially. They might not believe in it, but they do know what it is. Yeah. So what you see with the current war is there's essentially two types of readings or eschatological readings of this, or interpretations. There is this still prevalent kind of dispensational reading where even the involvement of Iran is important, because some of the dispensationalists will associate the impact of Iran or the disruption that Iran has towards Israel to a biblical text that we find in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, which is called the War of Gog and Magog. So a lot of people read this as dispensationalists, more particularly. They say that, the War of Gog and Magog will be something that will kind of be part of the early portions of the 7-year tribulation. So after the church is raptured, we're going to have this confederation of nations that will come up against Israel. That's what they read. They kind of do a futuristic modern reading of Ezekiel 38 and 39.
So we're just waiting for Russia and China to get involved on behalf of Iran.
That's exactly
and then we've got
it.
the Battle of Armageddon, right?
That's it. And the thing is, what's fascinating for them is that one of the nations that's part of the Gog and Magog confederation is Persia. So Persia is the ancient name for Iran. So you see, so they kind of do, a lot of dispensationalists engage in what I call news exegesis. So they're reading the news, they see what's going on geopolitically speaking, and they try to placate some of the biblical prophecies that they see as being accomplished or in line with some of the geopolitical events that are happening in the Middle East. So you have that reading. But you also have what you mentioned, Alan, this post-millennial kind of reading where we're not in the business of waiting for a rapture. We're not in the business of, we're not reading biblical history dispensationally as a periodization of history. We're not reading it necessarily like that, but we're just believing that the responsibility of the church is in the end times is to rise up in glory, power, and influence, and to extend the kingdom of God here now on earth, to build it now on earth, so that we can prepare for the return of Christ, who will take possession of the kingdom, essentially. So the post-millennial perspective is essentially that. Now, at the same time, one of the questions I often encounter is that how do Christians that have a dispensational view of the end times and those that are post-millennial kind of still agree in how they view the world, not the view the world, but their political impact or influence within the world. Because dispensationalists are not necessarily always disengaging themselves from politics or trying to change society. They will still, want to be involved and do what they need to do to change society. Dispensationalists that have this kind of perspective that kind of almost aligns in terms of their involvement in society, kind of aligns almost with the postmillennialists, is that for them, they read Jesus's parable where Jesus talks about the idea that the servants need to occupy till he returns. You see, so there's this parable that talks about, it gives you need to be busy while the master is away, be busy, do your work, do what you have to do. So they favor a particular translation, which says, occupy till I come. That means be busy. So as a dispensationalist, I still need to be busy. I still need to be involved in society. I'm still hoping for the rapture, but it doesn't prevent me to go to the Oval Office like Greg Laurie's did recently and pray for the president and be involved politically and try to influence. But he's still a dispensationalist. Where you'll have post-millennials that for them, this is natural. This is, of course, it's part of it because we're building the kingdom. You see, it's about, having the influence and making sure that the church will expand. So one eschatology is a bit catastrophic in the sense that there's all this, tribulation that's coming up and the Antichrist and all of that. Another eschatology is more, I would say, positive in its outlook of the future. And sometimes we refer to this eschatology as victorious eschatology. And what it does is, of course, it doesn't prevent either or from being involved, but the end goal is a bit different. So for them here, they're building the kingdom. The post-millennials are building the kingdom. That's their responsibility. And for example, Pete Hegseth adheres to this kind of theology. Even if he uses imprecatory prayers against, the Iranian regime, for him, it's about Jesus' sovereignty. And he ends his prayers with all bended knee on worshiping Christ and so on. So these are essentially the type of discourses that we encounter in terms of eschatology.
You mentioned the concept of occupying till he comes, and I think Christians across all different theological views would agree with that concept. And we've seen throughout history. I mean, you go back to the biblical church in the book of Acts, for example, right? The church is busy doing stuff for Jesus, winning souls, whatever. And then I think in your article you mentioned how there's this idea in the book of Genesis of exercising dominion, which Christians have interpreted differently throughout time, sometimes to be good stewards of the earth. But in this particular theology, this dominion theology that we're talking about here today, it seems like there's a shift away from the stewardship concept, which I think, again, all Christians would probably agree with on some level, to this more of this dominance. We're going to govern. We're going to take over, like you said, build the kingdom. And I'm curious how in your mind is this distinction? Why does it matter? And also looking at like social justice movements, let's say, of the past, which tend to be more on the liberal side of Christianity oftentimes, how does that compare to what the dominionists are trying to do right now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question also. It's true that it's how they view Scripture and how they interpret Scripture. And you said correctly in Genesis 1, for them, the focus is on subduing and dominating. And it's about not influence, but about domination. You see, there's nothing wrong with influencing. Everybody wants to influence. You have non-Christians, liberals, whatever. They get involved in politics. They want to influence. They want to share their view. But they're able to function in the context of a pluralistic society. You see, that's the main difference. Where, Christians are invited to be involved in politics. And they should be involved in politics. And they should have their voice heard. But at the same time, are they able to sit at a table across other individuals that have other priorities and other faiths and enter into a fruitful dialogue with them? Dominionists have a hard time with that. You see, this is not about influence. This is not about, let's work together and make this world a better place, and respect for other voices, and realizing that, it's not about creating a Christian hegemony and a Christian dominance over the entire societies, but it's about working collaboratively, working with, people that are Muslims or Buddhists or atheists or from different faiths, for even within the Christian communities that have different views. A lot of Dominionists, they're going to at first talk about, Christian unity. Mm-hmm. They're really strong. Hey, we have to band together and push against, the creeping secularism that's affecting our nation.
Right.
Okay, but when you're in power, then let's say you get the power and you're there. Which version of Christianity will dominate? Because there's going to be infighting. And we're starting to see that infighting at the moment. Yeah. We're starting to see people that are very influential in the charismatic dominion side of things. People like Lance Wallnau. I talk about him in the recent article that I published. So Lance Wallnau is going to talk about people like Christianity Today, or the magazine Christianity Today. And he's going to call this magazine who's been around for several decades, very influential in the Christian world, Christian evangelical world. It's a flagship magazine.
Right.
It's going to call it garbage. And he's going to say that it's under the influence of a spirit of religion. So he's going to use spiritual warfare tropes to label other Christians that don't align with his view of Christianity.
So that's
you're
exactly,
going to have go ahead.
That's where I was waiting for the opportunity to go next, because spiritual warfare it's in the title of your book. And it strikes me, it would be unfair to leave this podcast and to leave our listeners with the notion that the desire for dominance and that either side, left, right, or center, has a monopoly on intolerance, right? There's plenty of intolerance to go around. Dominionists are not the only ones who are intolerant.
Absolutely.
Okay? But there's a different element within, the evangelical dominionist movement, which is the temptation to indulge in a form of spiritual warfare, which attributes to those who believe differently that they're led demonically, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's very, very black and white. Talk for a minute about how, what that dynamic looks like.
Yeah, so it's actually another great question. Absolutely. The idea, we have to be clear about something. The idea of spiritual warfare is a Christian idea. So this is not like it exists. You read the New Testament, there are references to engaging in a form of war with forces of evil. It's there. But spiritual warfare, how it's seen, and even in Scripture, and even later on in the early church, first centuries of the early church, you read the Desert Fathers, people that went into the desert to fight the devil. Spiritual warfare was something that you engaged personally to fight your own evil inclinations against the forces of evil or inclinations that you had that were nefarious to you. That was spiritual warfare. You see, what has happened with time is that enemies became externalized. So we're blaming others for what's happening to us, to the world, instead of taking stock of our own responsibility. So there is a de-responsibilization of individuals that shift the problem to others, and they say, it's because they're controlled by evil forces. So there's been a demonization of political adversaries for quite some time now, where we're calling people like Kamala Harris, a Jezebel, being under a Jezebel spirit at the time of they were running for the election. So she's under the spell of a Jezebel spirit. So that's a demonic spirit that is influencing her and giving her success against Trump, a way to emasculate Trump. This is what people like Lance Wallnau was saying about Kamala Harris being under the influence of a spirit, or talking about the Democrats as being under the influence of demonic forces. This is why they're opposed to Trump constantly. So the concept of spiritual warfare is very, very prevalent within these groups, especially more so within charismatic dominion groups. But it doesn't, non-charismatics also have this kind of view. Now, it's interesting when we're talking, if we come back and circle back to the war in Iran, the war with Iran is also seen through the lens of spiritual warfare. And what they do is some of these charismatic dominionists will look at the war of Iran and say, the problem with Iran and the problem with the fact that they're under the bondage of Islam, it's because there's a principality over Iran that is called the Prince of Persia that needs to be dislodged spiritually from this geographical area. So they engage in what is called strategic level spiritual warfare, which is comprised of ideas like spiritual mapping, trying to figure out why does the gospel have such a hard time, for example, penetrating Muslim countries or other communities, even in the US. Let's say, churches have a hard time, you can't get any church plant in a specific area, or there's this community that's, not open to Christian ideas or whatever. So we engage in this kind of informed intercessory prayer, which couples with spiritual mapping to discern the supernatural invisible forces that are active over regions. It could be countries, it could be cities, it could be neighborhoods, it could be different places. And Christians need to engage and push back through spiritual warfare. This is done through various means. Of course, prayer is one of those means, worship, Jesus marches, things like that, but also political involvement, you see, and labeling clearly who the enemies are so that your followers can actually act against your enemies in terms of elections or politically speaking. So spiritual warfare is, in my sense today, it's become a prevalent concept, is in my sense today, the new rapture. You remember how I talked about how the rapture was such an embedded idea amongst Christians. Now we're talking about spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is this new kind of strong embedded idea when we talk about politics.
Interesting. And so, I'm thinking as you're talking about this, about the verse in Ephesians chapter 6 that, where Paul says, we wrestle not against people, essentially, but against principalities and powers. And yet, what's interesting to me about the movement as it's practically kind of lived out is that we're labeling people as being demonic, or as countries or political movements as being demonic. And so apparently in this theology, we as humans can determine who is being motivated by demons, or who might be demonic themselves, even though the Bible tells us to love our enemies. We're here to fight against spiritual powers, not people. So how do you see this playing out on a religious liberty, religious freedom level? Like, if someone is determined to be demonic, do they deserve to live? Do they deserve to have religious freedom? How does that really work in a society that's dominated by this kind of theology, this dominion theology?
Yeah.
And the folks who are saying this insist on robust religious freedom for themselves.
Oh, that's it. I think the answer is basically that. Essentially, it's about selective religious freedom. It's about religious freedom for us. And It doesn't mean that other religions cannot exist somehow, but they do not have preeminence within a society, and they should not be left to exhibit their own religious symbols or festivals or whatever above and beyond our kind of flavor of Christianity that we are promoting or that the nation has adopted. So it's essentially our religious freedom. You see, and it's not the religious freedom of others. And we see it like the thing is, and it's a good point, Stephen, that you're bringing up this verse, because this is the verse that they constantly use amongst others, but they constantly quote that verse to legitimize this battle. And the thing is, they kind of forget that it is really a spiritual battle, and it comes. There's a kind of a slippage at one point where, if we're fighting demons and demons are influencing people, and these people are an obstacle to the Christian hegemonic project, then the people are an obstacle and we have to somehow remove them. What does that entail? Does that entail to go to the extent of physical violence? In some cases, yes. And we, all of these questions, we're seeing it in America, but these ideas around spiritual warfare, politicization of religion and all of that amongst many of these groups, this has happened elsewhere in the world, even before, yes, now it's global, but even before seeing the full-fledged expression of this now in the American context, it has happened in other countries, in Latin America and other countries in Africa. So we have to look back. We have to do a bit of history, read what has happened politically in some of these countries, what the outcomes were. In some cases, it led to genocide. So you have to be aware of that, and we have to be aware that when you give full rein to these types of ideas, we might live with very, very nefarious consequences for American society.
Wow. So the quip that I have used often is that to a great extent, the modern American view of religious freedom is the freedom to believe as I do. So let me close. I want to bring this back around. We've gone a long time, and it's been fascinating, wonderful discussion. But we've talked about all of these different ideas, eschatology, end-time beliefs. But the $64,000 question is, are they actually influencing, for example, the decision to engage in, to initiate war in Iran? Are there faith leaders who have, voice and influence, or, can we know? I mean, we can see the convergence of these ideas and our actions, but is there actually evidence that these ideas are playing a role?
The thing is, a lot of the people that are around, and you saw the latest photo op of Trump surrounded by these pastors in the Oval Office. A lot of these people have the ear of the president. If you have someone like Paula White-Cain, who is a Pentecostal televangelist, who is in charge of the Faith Office, she's in the White House. The Faith Office now is close
in the White House.
In the White House, close to the president. So these people are constantly in contact, you see. And when you're at the point where you're signing executive orders against anti-Christian bias, and you're using the DOJ, you're weaponizing the Department of Justice, and coupling the Department of Justice with the Office of Faith to promote these types of rules and regulations against people that, would be deemed to have anti-religious biases, I think that there is influence that is very close to the president. Now, does Donald Trump understand all the eschatology that is behind this? No, Of course not. And are there other factors that come into play? Of course there are. But, when you listen to, and you probably saw this, conservative commentator Ted Cruz questioning someone like, not Ted Cruz, but Tucker Carlson, having an interview with the Senator Ted Cruz about the support for Israel, and that the senator is saying, my support for Israel politically and so on is based on what I learned in Sunday school, is that when you read in the Bible, it says that those that support Israel will be blessed, and those that, are not for Israel, they will be cursed. And it's important for America to be on the side of Israel. So that, historically, has been seen in a lot of the support that has been given to the modern state of Israel. And it's often rooted in those types of ideas and those types of issues. When you have someone like Mike Huckabee, who is now the ambassador to Israel, who is an avowed evangelical, being on a 2-hour podcast with Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson asks him, for example, okay, if you're for the Bible, for Israel, then talk to me about the borders of Israel. So when I read in Genesis 15, that's Tucker Carlson asking Mike Huckabee this question. When I read in Genesis 15, chapter 8, that the borders that God has given to Abraham will go from the great river in Egypt to the Euphrates, is that the borders of Israel? Should Israel, if they decided to conquer this area, would they be legitimized or justified to do so? And Huckabee says, yes, they would. So but they're not willing to do that. So it's quite, you have an ambassador that's very, very strongly adheres to a lot of the, I would say, dispensational framework of things that is an ambassador to Israel. So, yes, my sense is, of course, Trump doesn't understand everything that's going on around him, but there are people around him that are counseling him, giving him ideas about what to do, what should we do, how should we go about. Project 2025 is another example of the gutting out of education department and attacking the liberties and the liberties of minorities, of LGBTQ people, and so on. So yes, up to a certain extent, yes, even without Trump always understanding what's going on.
Well, I think this is very important for us to understand, in your work in monitoring all of this and kind of pulling these strands together. We can't all do that. We all get little tiny glimpses and pieces, and we don't know quite, are we really getting the story put together the right way? But, I'll close with this thought. The second book that Chuck Colson wrote after he got out of prison, after his time in the Nixon administration manipulating the faith community for their political purposes, he wrote a book called Kingdoms in Conflict, and he had a short story in that book about religious beliefs about Armageddon and end-time events influencing a United States president to initiate war in the Middle East, in Israel. And it was a cautionary tale about the relationship, of religion and our foreign policy. Whatever comes out of this war, for better or worse, as we sit here today, we don't know why. We don't have a coherent explanation as to why we're there or what we're doing there, right?
And what's the plan to get out of it?
So, understanding that religion, has played an influential role, I think is important for Americans to understand and to think twice about, what we're doing. So, Professor Gagné, thank you so much for taking your time and being with us, and for such a clear-headed, articulate explanation of some of these issues. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
I really want to thank you. You both had phenomenal questions. So it was very enjoyable to discuss with you. Thank you.
And with us as well. Well, that interview, Steve, finally scratched an itch that I have had for some time. That was just fantastic. What's your kind of takeaway from that discussion?
Yeah, very fascinating. Appreciate the work that he's doing in the space, because I think as was mentioned a couple of times, a lot of the wider world is thinking about these on a purely political level, and he's bringing that other dimension, which is the theology that's driving some of these, political decisions and these policy moves. And so it's vital, and you and I, as Christians ourselves who, believe in the Bible, we see we see things oftentimes through that biblical Christian or prophetic lens, and so we're looking at things that way. It's good to hear from other people in different faith traditions or in the scholarly realm, like Dr. Gagné, who are talking about these things, because it's important. So, what about yourself?
Well, I'm realizing that I'm going to need to write a new sermon.
Okay.
Because, what's present truth is how these false theologies of end times are driving the world in very dangerous, destabilizing places. And his discussion of spiritual warfare, I thought, was one of the more profound elements of the things that he covered, right? It's one thing to be intolerant of the other, and to kind of have a bad attitude about people whose beliefs you think are just wrong, okay? Yeah. But then to, elevate that disagreement to the point where those who disagree with you are demonically influenced, and it's dehumanizing. Right.
Yeah.
And then, you're like, yes, we have the right to destroy and fight against not only the demonic influence, but if you don't let go of it, you're on
the line too.
Right. And I just see that so consistently with the description in Revelation 13 about the movement that creates the mark of the beast and that demonizes and destroys those who don't agree with the dominant approach to religion.
Well, and Jesus said it explicitly in John 16:1 and 2, right? That the time will come when those who kill you will think they're doing God a service. It's pretty crazy. And yet I think what he described of this idea that, everything becomes kind of like a religious spiritual warfare issue, and your enemies are demon possessed. And so therefore you're justified in, maybe even killing perhaps, or at least excluding them from the same privileges and benefits that you might enjoy as a citizen. That's a really sobering and I think unchristlike way to look at the world. And so I think we as people of faith, you look back to the book of Acts, we briefly mentioned that. And the church in the book of Acts was concerned with really one thing, and that was spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. They weren't trying to dominate politically. They definitely weren't killing their enemies or cheering that on. In fact, they were trying to convert their enemies to Jesus through the power of persuasion and the Spirit, not through force. And that is what the Church of God always does. And the sign of a false church, I think, as Roger Williams or someone back then said, is that it persecutes. And that is not the way of Jesus. That's my opinion. And I'm going to
one of my quips over the years has been, the best way to destroy your enemy, make him your friend.
Okay. Jesus says, love your enemies. So there you go.
On that note, this has been Just Liberty. I'm your host, Alan Reinach, here with my guest, co-host, and colleague, Steve Allred. And until next week, remember, folks, be informed, get involved, and also eternal vigilance is and always has been the price of liberty.